Okay, so last time I left off, I cut off in the middle of uh, postmodern feminist artists. I actually ran into a technical detail. Somebody was knocking at my door, and then by the time I managed to shut this all down and get it started up again, I had to go do something else. So I actually never really finished the postmodern section. So I want to finish out this postmodern section, wrap this up, and get this uploaded for you. So we were talking about postmodern feminism, and postmodern feminism is really this kind of extension of third wave feminism. It uses the same tools as postmodernism. It deconstructs, but it deconstructs towards the purpose of a feminist ideology. Somebody asked a very excellent question on the discussion board today. Is postmodernism about message, or is it kind of about the image? Is the artist trying to just deconstruct something for the sake of it, for the creation of an image, or are they deconstructing something towards a message? And it's a very good question because it varies by artist. I think by the time we get to Damien Hirst, it's hard to know what Damien Hirst's messages is, at least in his later works. He's really just seemingly deconstructing things for the sake of deconstructing things. There are just some artists that want to see the world burn and kick over the apple cart. But the feminists, postmodernists, are very, very clearly trying to make a message in the service of the ideology of feminism and advancing new ideas in feminism. So we had just finished up with Cindy Sherman, but now we're going to go on and talk about Jenny Holzer. So Jenny Holzer has been active since 1968. She does have this context of appropriation of commercial advertising in space. She's also, in many ways, a kind of new media person. Yes, I coughed into my elbow. She was one of the first to actually appropriate commercial spaces, LED signs, etc. One of her most famous series was the Truism series, which she did in Times Square. Now, if you go to Times Square today, the Jumbotron there is much, much larger than this, and the one in my lifetime was larger than this. But this was really big. Traveling text on lighted screens was brand new technology in the 1960s and 70s. And so to take this very commercial space, probably the most commercialized space in the world, Times Square, and turn it to have these almost Marxist idioms and truisms was really powerful. Private property created crime. Protect me from what I want. Again, these ideas that consumerism fundamentally changes people. It creates this sense of false consciousness, this culture industry that Adorno talked about. And a lot of feminism straight up appropriates critical theory and moving forward with it. And so she was very famous for doing that. She would also do these living series where she would notice plaques that commemorated historical events or other items of note. And she went into a person who created these plaques, a company that created these plaques, and started creating plaques with these statements. Some days you wake up and immediately start to worry. Nothing in particular is wrong. It's just the suspicion that forces are aligning quietly and there will be trouble. What's interesting is she would also do this on signs. Bodies lie in the bright grass and some are murdered and some are picnicking. These are practically meme-worthy today, but she was doing these in the 80s, long before the internet. And again, these were the kind of plaques that you would see up around corporate offices, identifying office spaces, or historical plaques commemorating various items. And so it's really amazing that she was thinking about appropriating this space. We sometimes call this culture jamming, where you take something that people are used to seeing, something they're used to ignoring, some sign that says, head of, pediatric medicine or something, some stupid sign like that, or, CEO office, and then reappropriating it and making a message in a place you weren't used to seeing it. She also did a lot of large-scale installations, and that's what she's been doing recently. She did this large-scale installation in the Guggenheim, where you can see again her phrases integrated. These were done on traveling LED signs. She's also appropriated everything you can imagine, from the advertisements that are pulled behind airplanes above football games to the football game signs themselves. This is the big one that is over the AT&T Stadium. I think this is in Dallas. And this is the new Magnificent, and it says boredom makes you do crazy things, which now imagine this in the context. This is happening while the game is going on, so it's not just the space, it's the time she's appropriating, and you just have to wonder. And no one has actually ever given any context in this. She's done a number of other serious, wonderful, installations, again using signs of various types. In traveling signs and LED signs. She's also done large-scale projections. These are some of her more recent work from 2011, where you can see the phrases or how they're projected onto large surfaces. She's now doing large-scale projections onto buildings that still use these kind of idioms and other forms. I love this one. To acquire a political meaning, you don't even have to be human. Raw material will do, or protein feed, or crude oil. It's really kind of interesting. So she's taking the artifacts of consumerism and in the places of consumerism and recontextualizing them. She was going to do a project here at Bridal Veil Falls. They were going to project one of her massive projection up onto Bridal Veil Falls here a few years back, but it fell through largely because the BLM and the agency in charge of wildlife management wouldn't approve the environmental impact study that would take to get it done. It's a shame. We could have had a Jenny Holzer right here in our own valley. Another group that was active around the same time is the very famous Guerrilla Girls. And Guerrilla Girls are, again, one of the definitive groups of what we would call guerrilla art. And of course, there's a pun there. Guerrilla is a fighter, a kind of revolutionary fighter, but it's also, a homonym for these big hairy primates that live in Africa. See, that's 2 coughs in 1 lecture. Aren't you glad we've been online? Anyhow, and they've been around. They're an anonymous group of artists and activists and designers. They rely heavily on text, and they use public media and advertising. And they would literally go around and put up posters. These were wheat paste posters. This was, I have to remind you that the big era for the arrival of urban street art was late 1990s, early 2000s. So these women were, 20 years ahead of their time in that regard. The posters they would put up were of many varieties. They existed in a variety of types. Sometimes they were like handwritten notes. I love this. Dearest art collector, it has come to our attention that your collection, like most, does not contain enough art by women. We know that you feel terrible about this and will rectify the situation immediately. All our love, Guerrilla Girls. There's also a number of other posters there that talk about. One of their most famous ones was a series of posters that they did as bus shelter ads and also as billboard ads. Sometimes they would pay for the billboards and the bus shelters. Sometimes they just paste their poster over the existing space, in kind of a deliberate act of vandalism or a deliberate act of appropriation that was technically illegal. And so here we see, do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? Less than 5% of the artists in the modern art sections are women, but 85% of the nudes are female. It's fun. Here's another one that's really great. The advantages of being a woman artist. Some of them are not having to be in shows with men, seeing your ideas live on in the work of others, having the opportunity to choose between career and motherhood, being included in revised versions of art history. That's one of my favorites. So it talks about, and the last one, of course, getting your picture in the art magazines wearing a gorilla suit. Because they would dress up as gorillas, as you can see, and go and post these around, stage protests. They're still very active today. And it's a large group, and maybe there's been about 70, 80 different individuals, but there's about 20 individuals at any one time that do this. When racism and sexism are no longer fashionable, what will your art collection be worth? And then here it goes. The art market won't bestow megabuck prices on the work of a few white males forever. It's really kind of interesting, fascinating stuff. Then there's one of my favorite who works much in the same field. This is Barbara Kruger, who's still active. She started as a magazine art director. And I think it's very interesting that a lot of these postmodernists started in commercial art, much in the same way that the pop artists started in commercial art. And she was really fascinated by Futura typography, and that's been the font, the typography that has pretty much defined her career. She established so much of the aesthetics of the 1980s. She deals in slogans and irony, slogans about anti-consumerism. She's probably most famous for juxtaposing very simple slogans or text over ironic images. So there's a dichotomy between the image and the object. A lot of these images are stock images that she's taken. I shop, therefore I am, which became this kind of mantra of the 1980s. 1980s was an era of just kind of rampant consumerism. And therefore, this is a play on I think, therefore I am. I love this one. This is a 1950s piece of clip art where a girl is inspecting this boy's muscle, and it says, "We don't need another hero." She's also very active in issues regarding reproductive freedom. So Your Body as a Battleground was created specifically for that, showing how reproductive freedom is constantly under attack. And then she started doing these large-scale installations in the early 2000s. Who Will Write the History of Tears? Still very much the same kind of aesthetic. I love her stuff. And still very anti-consumerist. And then things get a little strange. And by mean strange, that they kind of invert on themselves. She started doing things very much interacting with the corporate world. And she had become so successful, and even though a lot of her stuff had attacked the consumerist and corporate world, the consumerist corporate world began seeking her out deliberately to create things. And this was one of the most famous things. This was W, which was a trendy magazine in the early 2000s, no longer exists. It's gone belly up. But this was right at the height of fame of Kim Kardashian. And she was just everywhere. She was ubiquitous. Before that, it was Paris Hilton. But Kim Kardashian is one of these strange celebrities where before celebrities were famous for a variety of things, but now celebrities are famous simply for being famous. They came with the right name, they came with the right look, etc. And then I love this how the slogans in the Futura font and her red and white traditional palette block out the naughty bits, which of course are the bits that she's most famously known for. And it says, "It's all about me, I mean you, I mean me." So here is an anti-consumerist slogan selling a magazine and pushing this. And people wonder, wait a minute, is she making fun of this? Or has she embraced this? It gets even more complicated when you get to the Selfridges campaign. The Selfridges campaign was done a few years earlier, but it shows this same thing. Selfridges is a department store. A very successful department store, and they actually commissioned her to do a display. So you now have the corporate world embracing anti-corporate, anti-consumerist aesthetics for the purposes of marketing goods. And so over the top of all of the goods, there were these slogans. You want it, you buy it, you forget it. I shop, therefore I am. It's you, it's new, it's everything, it's nothing. And this was actually the sale. This was not just her making fun of the sale. This was her actually commissioned to sell this. It's kind of a bizarre world we live in. We are so steeped in irony. We're folded into irony 3 or 4 times now that the corporate world has completely embraced it. I've always said this. I used to work in a sign company in Las Vegas. And I used to joke to people, I said, I never ever tell people crazy ideas anymore because sure enough, it's going to become true. If I say, oh, what's going to be next? A Byzantine-themed casino? You know what? It would happen. You come up with those ideas, you deserve to get paid for them because they're going to happen. Anything was possible in Las Vegas. And we now live in a world where anything is possible, where anti-consumerism is in the service of consumerism. It's really kind of amazing. We also have other artists that are doing much the same thing, exploring issues, but they're more in the performance space. One of my favorites is Janine Antoni. So Janine Antoni was famous for doing body art that was very much focusing on the ideas of food and consumption, the relationship between women's bodies and consumption. And here we have her using her hair to paint in a variety of substances, sometimes chocolate, sometimes other materials, always consumable materials. This is perhaps one of her most famous pieces. This is called Gnaw. It was made in 1992, and these are two massive blocks. One is a block of chocolate, and the other one is a block of lard. And what she did is she would chew off the chocolate and chew off the lard. So you have an object which is kind of mass-consumed material, and here she is consuming it, and literally consuming it, but it leaves a record of her mark, much in the same way that she uses her hair to paint. She's used her teeth to carve this, but then the material would be gathered up, and lard is a major component in cosmetics, and the lard that she chewed would be used to make lipstick and other cosmetics, and the chocolate would actually be repurposed, and she would spit it back out and be repurposed to make chocolates. So again, she is making consumer products through the process of consuming. So you could see how that's folded in on itself. Here's another example. This is Lick and Lather. She cast life busts of herself, and one would be cast in soap, and the other one would be cast in chocolate. And then, of course, chocolate is the lick, and she would lick her own image until the image was unrecognizable. For the soap, she would take it into her with a bath, and she would use the soap of her own image to wash her own body until her own image had deteriorated. So here you can see a chocolate bust before she's licked it, and here's a soap bust after she's used it for a while as a soap bar. And so this is very much about the image of a person and how they are degraded over time, how the female image has become a consumable image. Getting into third wave feminism, one of the major features of third wave feminism is it tries to tackle the perspectives of non-white, non-middle class individuals. And one of my favorites in this regard is Kara Walker. I first saw Kara Walker in the early 1990s when I was in Philadelphia. She had a major show at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I was absolutely just stunned by it. She does a combination of large-scale installations, but usually paper silhouettes, although she's now gone into just massive installations. We'll see this. Her themes deal with the recasting of racial tropes and stereotypes, and she focuses on themes that come out of the antebellum South, that is, the pre-Civil War South, the South of slavery. Her items are made up of paper cutouts. Now, this is intentional. Paper silhouettes were one of the ways before the advent of photography to record a likeness. And the cutting of paper silhouettes were very popular in the late 18th century and the early 19th century, what we would call the Regency period, for those of you who are into period dramas, but in America we call the antebellum South. And so she took really horribly racist stereotypes and reappropriated them through these paper silhouettes. Here we have the thick lips, the natty hair of this racial stereotype of an African female, a voodoo doll, and another figure representing a person who would be a pre-Civil War kind of plantation owner. Here we have a woman, obviously in a white silhouette with this elaborate hairdo, being supported by a figure that is clearly a barefoot African figure walking in the grass. She often deals with themes of slavery. There were actual collars that were placed upon African American slaves, and so she's elaborated on this, creating bells and other features to deal with this issue. Usually, she sometimes does small works with an individual paper silhouette, but she usually does massive installations that fill whole walls. And the titles are usually overwrought. So if you know anything about early 19th century novels, they tend to have these long, overbearing titles that are very expressive. So the titles are equal to the images in the sense that they both portray a kind of absurdity. This one is Gone, a historical romance of a civil war as it occurred between the dusky thighs of one young negress and her heart. This is one that I actually saw. It's really impressive. So we see a collection of figures Some are clearly African, some are clearly white. We see the Spanish moss indicating the South. We also see a great number of sexual references. And we always see this difference between the positions of people of African heritage. They're portrayed full-on stereotype. She is African American, so she's appropriating this imagery. But then we see white people, and it lays out the kind of hypocrisy. There's a suggestion of a narrative here, but no real concrete narrative. But we do get a sense of the hypocrisy of white people as they interact. Now, what does this have to mean for our day? Well, what she's saying is that this is pretty much the world we live in today. She's using some very, very shocking kind of anachronistic imagery and material to talk about how this legacy is still with us. Here's another one, this massive tableau. And this is the full title, Slavery, Slavery, presenting a grand and lifelike panoramic journey into picturesque Southern slavery of life at Old Virginie's Hole. Sketches from plantation life. See the peculiar institution as never before, all cut from black paper by the able hand of Cara Elizabeth Walker, an emancipated negress and leader in her cause. And that's a hilarious title, because there were these sensational dime novels, these pulp novels that were published during the 19th century that sensationalized slavery. If you've had my classes before, you realize that Mormons didn't escape this. There were these sensational dime novels that had these elaborate titles. So what's interesting is, even though the title suggests something about this emancipated negress, which is her, which is a 20th and 21st century African American, it suggests she still connects to that legacy, that even in emancipation there is this tone of exploitation. So we see the Spanish moss, the trees, but we also see a variety of, again, sexual themes, scatological themes, vomiting, other things as well, showing the preposterous reality of that world. And this thing wraps around 3 sides of the room, so you can't even really get a full photograph of it. You just kind of have to experience it. One of her more recent works has been very provocative, and also, I think, perhaps the most powerful, is called A Subtlety or the Marvelous Sugar Baby. And this thing is a colossal installation. So the installation is made in an old sugar warehouse in Brooklyn. And sugar is huge in America. I hope you realize that. Americans eat an insane amount of sugar. The New World was built on essentially 3 crops: cotton, tobacco, and sugar. The plantations that produced tobacco were huge, but the plantations that produced cotton were bigger. And as big as those were, the plantations across the Caribbean that produced sugar were bigger still. And it's funny because slavery in America was horrible, but it simply wasn't on the same scale as slavery in the Caribbean and in South America and Latin America. And most of that was dedicated to the production of sugar. And the market for most of that sugar was America. So sugar, even something like sugar, isn't uncomplicated. Americans have always had a sweet tooth since the very beginning, and our desire and our thirst for sugar actually covers up a whole ugly history. So what we have here are several figures. The figures themselves are representations of African Americans, or Africans, or African Caribbeans, or Africans from Latin America, people of African descent from the African diaspora. And these figures are covered in molasses. Molasses is this process of making sugar. But then in the center of it is this sphinx-like form that has this very stereotypical racist kind of depiction of what we would call an African mammy style figure. And this is still with us today. If Aunt Jemima, the products that are sold, she has this head covering and headscarf, but she is aligned sphinx-like. Now this is actually made out of carved foam, but it's actually covered. The outer kind of half inch of this is pure sugar. So this is made out of sugar. And of course, then towards the rear, we get this large distended rear, which of course is again another form of sexualization. And so we see in this a combination of sexual content, of the exploitation. This is them actually building it. and the exploitation of African Americans in the sugar industry, and that it's put in this old abandoned sugar warehouse that's in Brooklyn just kind of shows this. This massive warehouse was dedicated to an industry that has quite a bit of exploitation in it. These are very, very powerful images, these recontextualizations, and again, postmodern, deconstruction of everything that goes into our history. Another great artist that comes out of this generation is Kiki Smith. Kiki Smith is the daughter of sculptor Tony Smith, and she recontextualizes biblical narratives and themes of birth and death, and also issues of regarding body shame. She mostly works in polyester resin or other cast forms that are taken from life. Here we have an image of the Virgin Mary, but the image is skinless, showing this kind of, the sexuality has been removed, the identity has in a way been removed and yet revealed. Again, this recontextualization of a biblical theme. This is a very, very powerful work. This is Lilith. If you're not familiar, Lilith is a figure out of Jewish folklore. Adam had a wife before he had Eve, and this wife was disobedient and caused all kinds of problems, and then she was kind of banished, and then Eve was brought in. And so Lilith becomes the mother of the creatures that we would call fairies, or creatures that are elves, or other kind of creatures that exist. She becomes this kind of dark figure, a mother of monsters and nightmares, and she becomes this kind of source of evil in the Jewish folklore. And the way this figure is presented, it is cast in polyester resin from life cast, but then it's placed on the wall so that it's inverted. Again, Lilith is this inversion of femininity as it's supposed to be, as opposed to Eve, that was supposed to be submissive and supportive and nurturing. And here we see, when you look into her, she has these dazzling blue eyes that you can only see from this perspective. And it's often the case that you have this kind of interplay. Lilith has been reappropriated by feminists in third wave feminism as a symbol of independence, that she was not the submissive wife, and therefore she became this source of independence. So you take something that was a negative and turn it into a positive. But it's a very terrifying, powerful image. And issues regarding to body shame, one of her most famous, Kiki Smith's, is Tail. Tail is, again, this polyester resin figure that has a tail coming out of it, and there's a play on words. There's Tail, which is a tail, an appendage, and then there's Tale, which is the title of the work, which is a tale like a story. And this is like a line of excrement. There's this feeling of excrement and body shame coming out of the figure, again indicating that women are always treated as extensions of their body and can't get past their body. I love this quote about it. The tailpiece was about kind of shame and humiliation about something, like that you're dragging this sort of internal personal garbage around with you all the time, and also the shame and humiliation of not being able to hide it, that it's so apparent in one's own being. There are other artists who are doing similar things. Jenny Saville is a contemporary artist who's painting right now, who does these beautiful paintings, and by beautiful I mean technically they're beautiful in terms of light, form, shadow, composition. But she often does these distended female figures, and these female figures have distorted bodies, and then as if carved in their skin across the surface of the bodies, we have words, things like delicate, supportive, decorative, words that are associated with submissive forms of femininity and ideas that objectify women. And so when you have a woman making female nudes, playing on these words and themes, she's deconstructing the idea of what the female nude is supposed to be. And I would also put in this category of deconstruction of ideas of femininity, Tracy Emin. But we're going to hold off on talking about her stuff because she's actually a member of the next group that we're going to talk about, which is the Young British Artists. So the Young British Artists are a part of this movement that started in the early 1990s. most of them came out of the BFA programs at Goldsmiths, the University of London. Many of them were Turner Prize winners. Turner Prize is the premier award for contemporary art in England. And so it's usually given, it's the equivalent of £100,000, which is a considerable sum of money. I think it's actually bigger now. I think it's been increased. But in the 1990s, it was £100,000, which at the time would have been about $350,000 US. I think the pound is weaker against the dollar now. And this was awarded by the Tate Modern for the greatest living British contemporary artist. And there were several of these artists, Rachel Whitehead, Tracy Emin, Chris O'Feely, Damien Hirst, which were all British artists that were producing things at this time. They are also closely related to the collector Charles Saatchi. Charles Saatchi was a major collector of contemporary and modern art, and he put together an exhibition. This is called the Sensation Exhibition, and it was an exhibition that started in 1997 in Royal Academy of Arts in London, and in 1999 it traveled to the Brooklyn Museum. It was at Brooklyn Museum that this caused a major scandal involving Rudy Giuliani and this very famous painting, The Holy Virgin Mary by Chris O'Feely. But we'll talk about that when we get to Chris O'Feely. What identified all of these artists together as a movement was, again, this kind of ultimate extension of deconstruction, a deconstruction of Western art and a new perspective of looking at things. They were all young. They were all under 30 when this whole thing started, and very, very eager and very, very much trying to change the world. And many of them have gone on to be massive household names that are still around. They also fully embraced scandal. And that was kind of interesting that the exhibition was called Sensation, because that was the whole point of this. It also marks where, for the first time, you cannot separate big money and the interests of big money from art. Art had always been a big money feature, but there's a huge jump in the prices for paintings and works of art by living artists in the 1990s. When Mark Rothko was selling paintings for $100,000 in the late 1960s, that was a huge sum. That would be like selling a painting for $1 million today. And so there's always been celebrity artists, but this was on another level entirely. These artists jump up to a completely different tier. Artwork starts selling not just for $1 million, but for tens of millions of dollars. And so we have living artists who have work sold, sometimes directly from the gallery itself, for 10, 20, 30 million dollars. And those prices have continued to this day. There has been this massive explosion in the prices of living contemporary artists. And it's kind of a bizarre phenomenon. No one's really quite certain why it happened. I think it was a mixture of the time, the media, and Charles Saatchi is a very important feature of it, being this collector. He collected all of these artists. And this is where the art market, especially the blue chip galleries, Art Basel and some of these others, get more than just a tad incestuous. Because if you're pushing an exhibition that has artists that you collect, this increases the value of your collection. And many of these collectors were buying artists sight unseen, purely as investments. We are in the midst of an art bubble. In the same way there was a real estate bubble, in the same way there was a dot-com bubble where people just started pouring money into it. Since at least the late 1990s, we have been in a major contemporary art bubble, and there are indications that it's currently starting to burst. Just as the real estate bubble burst, just as the dot-com bubble burst, all these bubbles start by a heightened interest. As people jump into it, it seems like a sure thing, and then everybody buys into it. The dot-com bubble and the real estate bubble were serious economic problems because they really damaged the livelihoods of a lot of innocent people. The real estate bubble destroyed the pensions and retirement funds of a lot of people that were invested in the real estate market. If this bubble bursts, I'm not going to feel too bad about it because the people who have invested in it are a bunch of billionaires. But if you have a bunch of billionaires just basically pouring billions of money in, and you have a scramble and a mad dash for a smaller group of artists, it's going to raise their status. And now we live in a very strange world indeed. The art world actually did kind of respond to criticism and did respond to academic and art criticism, academic opinion, and the opinion of art critics before the 1990s. Now it doesn't. It doesn't at all. It almost entirely responds only to a few blue chip galleries, only to a few gallery dealers. And those gallery dealers are very selective. And so you're like, okay, now how do we know what the value of an artist is? If the gallery decides, okay, this is the artist we're going to push, and all the billionaires say, so which artist am I buying? And the gallery owner says, this one, and they buy it, and that elevates the artist, and suddenly you have an artist that's getting $20 million for a single work of art. Okay, what's the value of that? You realize that there's the possibility for all kinds of shenanigans, and it's really undermined faith in contemporary arts. I'll be perfectly honest about it. A lot of the kind of silent majority of America has written off contemporary arts altogether. But this is something that has really troubled even people who are believers in contemporary art, people who are faithful believers. If you're interested in this stuff, I strongly suggest the writings of Sarah Thornton. Sarah Thornton writes about this stuff and how the contemporary art world has changed. It also, the Young British Artist is significant because this is probably the last time that we had a coherent movement that we could talk about. And since this time, we're now 25 years on from this, and we still don't really know what the future of contemporary art is or how this movement works. We're still doing the same kind of things. Okay, so let's talk about a few of these artists. So one of them right off the bat is Rachel Whitehead, right? Rachel Whitehead started creating these negative spaces where she would make a plaster cast of a room. So what you're looking at here is the negative space of a room rendered into a positive space because of a plaster cast. This is the molding. This is the baseboard molding. This is the crown molding. This is actually a fireplace that sticks out into the room. So it is a different way of looking at space. It's a deconstruction of architectural space. So it's still using these kind of themes of deconstruction. These are book corridors. So what you're looking at here is the negative space above the books. So these are where the books on the shelves were. She would do this to actual houses. I quite like Rachel Whitehead. I think it gives a sense of how you can see something different, how you can see the interior volume. You pour plaster into a space like it's a Jell-O mold, and it pulls something out. And this was commentary about public and private spaces in many ways. Tracy Emin would do these interesting installations that again were kind of deconstructions. You could place her in with feminists, but she was part of the Young British Artists movement, so I'm throwing her in here. This is Tracy Emin's Everyone I Have Ever Slept With, and it is literal truth of everyone she's ever slept with. You can see the dates on the exterior, 1963 to 1995. So tents are shelters. Tents are places, you put up a tent in the backyard. It's a place you go. It's for camping. It's kind of associated with fun. And here she is kind of given a document, kind of very childish in a way, a document of all of the individuals that she has slept with, male, female, etc. And she writes in the middle, you can see with myself, always myself, never forgetting. And that the people that she slept with. Now, of course, this is obviously in the context of the AIDS crisis. Sex used to be free, and part of the sexual revolution is you could have sex with whoever you wanted. But by the early 1990s, everybody realized, yeah, that's probably a bad idea. And so you probably shouldn't because of STDs and AIDS. And there was this common phrase that was said at the time that, you sleep with somebody, you're sleeping with them and everybody that they've slept with. And so this is kind of an exploration of that idea that your sexual history is somehow with you. It's part of your identity. You carry it around like baggage. You can't get away from it. And so she sets it up in this tent. This stuff was very shocking, very personal, and very revealing. Uh, and it made her very successful. Again, she won the Turner Prize Award. I forget the exact year. And this caused her to create this piece. This is Tracy Emin's Bed that I referred to earlier, that could be seen as a feminist work, but I also think is probably better in context as a work of young British artists. But it can be read both ways. I think contemporary art is multivalent that way. So she was going through a number of problems, becoming a very successful artist, but at the same time, she was having a trouble coming up with her next work. And she was also an addict. She was also sleeping with a lot of people. She was using a lot of alcohol and drugs and other things as well. And she woke up one day and was trying to come to terms with all of this, trying to come to terms with this. She was also suffering from a bout of art block. And she was trying to come up with something that expressed all of this anxiety and turmoil that she was feeling. And she realized she didn't need to express it, that the detritus of the life of her own life had accumulated around her was speaking it better than she ever could. So she took her actual bed, this is her bed, with the used pantyhose, the packed luggage, the slippers, the empty liquor bottles, the cigarettes, the drugs, everything else, even a little stuffed animal, used tissues, all the rest of it. And she took it into the gallery and set it up. And so people could experience it and feel it exactly as it was. So this is such a fascinating work of art because it is what it is. It's just the bed. And I have to say, I do not like this work of art. It makes me feel very uncomfortable. I think that when you get close to this, it feels very weird. It feels very voyeuristic. You're obviously peering into a very private moment in somebody's life. So while it is not a work of art to my taste, I will defend this thing to the end of time as a work of art. People often say, how on earth can this be a work of art? It's just a bed. It's just been moved into the gallery. And again, art isn't necessarily supposed to be about something that's beautiful or inspiring. It sometimes can be very personal and revealing. You walk into the presence of this bed, you feel, I guarantee you feel this very visceral sense of revulsion, disgust. It's very, very powerful. So it's successful as a work of art. I think it's not meant to be a pleasing work of art. It's not meant to be a work of art that necessarily makes you think. It's meant to evoke pure, raw emotion. And in that way, I think it's very, very successful. It's kind of an ultimate form of deconstruction. It's a very honest form of deconstruction by bringing the deconstruction directly into the gallery. It's bringing their life directly into the gallery. So that brings us to Chris O'Feely. I'm not going to say much about Chris O'Feely because we have a student doing a presentation on Chris O'Feely. But Chris O'Feely likewise was deconstructing things and had very strong sexual themes. His technique was to use collage. So what you're seeing here is collage. And he would often take examples or pieces of collage from pornographic magazines. And so we have a collection of figures of pornographic magazines collaged together with different heads. We have mismatched legs and parts put together. Of course, the overall thing is a smiley face on a phallic symbol. And then we have these large kind of balls. And these balls are actually elephant dung. Chris O'Feely is of African descent. And so this is an appeal to an African heritage because in Africa, elephant dung is a kind of a symbol of life. It's used as a fertilizer and becomes a source of life. So he would shellac these things over and preserve them and use them to support the paintings. The paintings would have gold backgrounds. Again, these gold backgrounds would be references to icons and to religious icons. And phallic symbols are very common in African art as symbols of potency or symbols of life. Not just male potency, but regeneration. And so, of course, porn is, of course, about stimulating sexual contact and content and feelings. And so, therefore, it's very appropriate to take these Western ideas of sexual and mix them with non-Western ideas. Perhaps his most famous work would be this one, The Holy Virgin Mary. In this case, again, we have elephant dung attached. We have this very kind of stylized, very Africanized representation of the Virgin Mary with radiating gold lights and gold. Again, the gold represents, this goes all the way back to medieval and Byzantine art. And then we have depictions taken again from pornography of anuses and sexual themes from behind, so that we're seeing the anus, the vulva. These are sources of sexual desire, but they're also sources of life. So he's taking ideas of sexuality in the West and comparing them to ideas of life-giving. Again, the elephant dung is there. In this case, the elephant dung is placed directly over the breast, almost as if it's a nipple, a kind of form of nursing. So this references the lactating virgin. There are these traditions of lactating virgins in Western art as a source of life. Now, this caused an enormous scandal when it was shown, not so much in London, but especially in Brooklyn. And I guess I have to address the controversy. There was a series of controversies in the late 1990s. Andre Serrano did his very famous Piss Christ, where he did a photograph of a plastic crucifix in a jar of urine. And he claimed he was doing it for aesthetic reasons, but then you have to ask the question, well, then why call it Piss Christ? No one would know it was urine if you didn't tell them. And so, there were these very, very provocative images. This one, of course, is a very provocative image. And he says he was trying to deal with these ideas of sexuality. And I'm trying to give as close as I can to a natural representation. But again, remember, we're talking about postmodernists, and postmodernists lie. And the lie is part of it. Jeff Koons lied. Everybody lies. And so, they would sometimes make up these elaborate artist statements to kind of justify it. But you wondered if these elaborate artist statements were, in fact, just word salads to justify the shock value of it. And to me, that doesn't offend me. To me, if you want to shock and you want to lie about the shock, that's part of the art. And that's been true ever since pop art. And postmodernism just embraces that. Like, I remember how I told Roger Scruton called it the fake fake. That it's fake, and it knows it's fake, and it presents itself as fake. So there's aspects of this. Now, this one is why I like this one, because this one I think is very real in some level. And I have to say that I think a lot of both Jeff Koons and Chris O'Feely's work falls into the category of a fake fake. I've heard Chris O'Feely defend this work, and I'm like, come on, you were going for the shock value, because he insisted he wasn't going for shock value. I'm sorry. And that he didn't realize, he was shocked that anybody would be shocked at this. Come on. You knew this would be shocking. Just own it. Just own it already. So this went into the Brooklyn Museum. Of course, the Brooklyn Museum is a museum that's funded by New York City. And so it's funded by taxpayer dollars. And so this went up in the Sensation exhibition. And Andre Serrano's work, Mapplethorpe's works, a bunch of these works were all funded in part either by state funds or by the National Endowment of the Humanities or the National Endowment of the Arts. And this caused a huge scandal. This was back in the Clinton years. You have to recognize what's happening in 1998. You have the Clinton impeachment going on. You have the Monica Lewinsky scandal. So a bunch of Republicans got into a bit of a snit. Let me just put it that way. that with the Monica Lewinsky scandal, it really did seem as if the world was going to hell in a handbasket, and that there was this incredible relaxing of moral standards, particularly moral sexual standards. What's really interesting is that we're going through one of those kind of eras now because of Harvey Weinstein and because of Me Too. But what's interesting is to see how the political parties are switched in their positions. So at the time, the Republicans were like, our moral fabric is collapsing. It's absolutely disintegrating. And so the last thing they wanted was a painting sexualizing the Virgin Mary and having pornography on it. It was just unacceptable. And of course, the mayor of New York at the time was Rudy Giuliani. Now, here's where things get really fun. Rudy Giuliani, used to dress up in drag. He cheated on his wife. and then basically got kicked out of his wife's house and spent that time with two of his gay friends. And so he's hardly the person you would imagine that could be a paragon of virtue. He's not a social con. He's not one of these. He's not an ideal person for evangelicals to rally around. But also remember the context. It's 1999. What's happening in 2000? It's an election year. And nobody was thinking about George Bush. Everybody was thinking about Giuliani. Giuliani was, he had turned New York around. New York had been full of crime, and he had completely turned New York around and had really done a very good job in restoring New York to its former glory. Some say he turned it into a modern-day Disneyland, but everybody I know who lives in New York, who lived in New York prior to Giuliani said, oh, the crime was terrible. The city didn't work. It just didn't work. It didn't function. And they were very, very happy. They may not have mentioned it in public, but Giuliani turned that city around. But Giuliani was, a big Northeastern liberal. He really wasn't a believable social conservative con, but it's obvious that he had presidential aspirations. It was obvious that he had presidential aspirations. And so he was setting himself up for a run in 2000 to run against Al Gore and to be the nominee. And George W. Bush was a nobody. Nobody really thought anything of him at the time. And so he needed an issue. He needed a wedge issue to basically prove to the Republican base that he wasn't this big Northeastern liberal rhino, a Republican in name only, but that he really did have social conservative credentials. So he picked a fight with the Brooklyn Museum. And then he said, my integrity as a Catholic and everything. Guy divorced his wife. Divorce is wrong in Catholicism. He cheated on his wife too. So last I heard, that's pretty much against the Catholic Church too. So when it happened, I was never convinced. I always thought it was a cynical ploy. I always thought he was trying to develop he was just using this as a convenient ploy to develop his credentials among social conservatives in the hope of a future bid to be president, to run for president, or maybe Senate in the Senate in New York. And this is, of course, all before 9/11. So this is before he had 9/11 and his record with 9/11 had elevated him. As cynical as that was, the director of the Brooklyn Museum was equally cynical. I used to have his name in my notes, but I don't anymore. He knew what he was doing. He knew what he was doing. He knew that this was going to blow up. So it was an absolute travesty. You had the director of the Brooklyn Museum saying, so Giuliani demands that this thing be taken down. He demands that funds no longer be used to fund this kind of thing, that it offends him as a Catholic. And the director of the Brooklyn Museum said, this is censorship, etc. And they both got what they wanted out of it. Let me be honest. Giuliani got this massive push and credentials with the social conservatives. And the director, everybody said, well, what's the big deal about? So everybody went. The Brooklyn Museum had been struggling for years to get people in to see some of its contemporary art exhibits, but nothing will get people in the doors like a manufactured controversy. So I always felt like it was a kind of it was two cynical people exploiting the situation to maximum effect. I can take Chrysophilia or leave him, but it just finds it something. But it was indicative of the era that, and it's changed everything, because now, of course, National Endowments of the Arts does not give direct grants to individual artists. There were individual grants given to both Mapplethorpe and a few handful of others, Serrano, and that just ended that right away. And that ended it. It changed forever arts funding in America, or what people thought. And I think the sad thing about it is there was a lot of good artwork in the Sensation exhibition, a lot of good artwork. But because it became about this painting, the biggest thing that happened to it is a lot of Americans just said, whatever. And I think you've seen the impact of that. I don't know how I can express this to you, but art mattered in the 80s and 90s. It really did. it really had shock value. It really could energize the population. You know, something like this would show up at a museum in Brooklyn and the whole country would be talking about it. And it really mattered. Has anything like that happened since? Can you think of a thing that's happened like that since? Not a single thing. Nobody talks about it. You know, I mean, you could do the Virgin Mary, pardon my language here, getting gang-banged in a gigantic portrait and offend everybody, and I bet it wouldn't even make the nightly news. You know, maybe some local people be offended, but everybody else would be like, whatever. And it's kind of sad because it really marked a turning point. It marked a turning point where people kind of gave up on contemporary art, and the ability of contemporary art to shock and amaze was really downgraded. And we have this conversation today. You know, a major feature of the avant-garde is pushing the envelope, and that has been a major feature of the avant-garde since the avant-garde has existed in the 19th century. But that was the last era. The 1990s was really the last era I can ever remember anybody pushing the envelope and anybody getting excited. Now, everybody just shrugs. It's like, yeah, whatever, you know. It's like, the teenagers are at it again, you know, they toilet papered our house again. Oh, well, you know, you get old, you get past it. And now we're at a point where the avant-garde is just moribund. What is the purpose of the avant-garde? So, sensation is an important movement in the history of art because its name was accurate. It was the last time I can actually remember people being excited. I was going to grad school at the time, and I've been doing contemporary art pretty much since, and I can't think of a single show that got that kind of national or international attention where something was really shocking. Now people just say, oh, okay, you know. Yeah, I think you could drag a human being into the middle of a gallery and slit their throat, and most people would be like, oh, okay. I hope, you know, I mean, that's kind of scary, but, you know, we've lost this ability to be shocked. And I think maybe it's because of the internet. You know, the internet came along and suddenly, and also we got into 9/11. We got into 9/11, we got into the War of Terror. If you want, you can look up videos on the internet of people slitting other people's throats. And and then the explosion of pornography in the 1990s. And it was shocking at the time, you know, and again, because of the Monica Lewinsky thing, the scandal, there was this sense that we were losing our moral character. And what's funny is everybody was like, oh, we're going to have a real conversation. We're going to have a real conversation. And, you know, and on one side you had the social conservatives saying, we're finally going to rein the crazies in. We're going to rein them in and we're going to stop it. And then on the other side, it's like, this is it. This is it. This is the coming of The Handmaid's Tale. You know, that, you know, you had people on the left who were always expecting this impending theocracy, this fascist evangelical Christian theocracy. Oh, this is it. The Dominionists, they're going to come and they're going to set up a horrible theocratic fascist society. And, you know, you see this in the comic books of the time, V for Vendetta. You see this in the books, Handmaid's Tale, which they just recently made into a television series. So the left had its paranoid delusions that, you know, the right was just going to take over and it was just going to squelch all this down. And, of course, the right had its paranoid delusions. It's like, oh, my gosh, we're descending into Sodom and Gomorrah, and we need to do something about it before we lose our country. And what really happened is something entirely different. What really happened is people went, huh. That's just amazing. But it's like, you know, it's like we kind of shrugged. It's like, whatever. And holy crap, you know, I never expected that. You know, the fever dreams of both the left and the right never took place. Instead, you know, contemporary art didn't go out with a bang. It went out with a whimper. It's kind of sad. All right. Well, I've talked this thing to death. Let's go on to Damien Hirst. So if there's an artist that really typifies what the young British artists were all about, it's Damien Hirst. So Damien Hirst, again, came through this Goldfinch program. Was a Turner Prize winner, and he was producing these works of art that I think his early works of art are really interesting, really fun. They're these glass box pieces. He does a whole series of them. One of his earliest ones is called 1,000 Years. It's done in 1990, and it has two compartments. You can see the two compartments, and in one compartment is an actual cow's head. This isn't a prop. This is an actual cow's head. And on the other side was a collection of maggots. And what would happen, or flies to begin with, there was a single hole passing from one side of the box to the other, and what would happen is that the flies would find their way to the other side, and they would lay their eggs in the cow's head, and then the maggots would be born. And then the maggots would grow into, of course, larvae, and then fully formed flies, who would then repeat the cycle. But over the cow's head is a bug light. It's a bug zapper. And this is all sealed. This is all self-contained. So what would happen is you would have this kind of reiteration of life, this cycle of life, but then the flies themselves would die. And this would go through several cycles with thousands of flies. This thing was well sealed up so the flies couldn't get out. But eventually, the head would be completely consumed by maggots. There would be no more resources, and all of the flies would eventually die, most of them being killed off by the bug light. So this is an exploration of mortality, and we are so removed from nature in our lives. I mean, maybe the coronavirus will remind us how much we are removed from nature. But we're removed from nature. We think of ourselves as invincible, as impenetrable. Our food comes to us on plastic, foam, styrene trays wrapped in plastic. Even 100 years ago, most people were killing their food, raising their own food. They dealt with the reality of death. I can never remember this philosopher's name, but I've always agreed with it. He says that the purpose of modern life seems to be to separate us from the realities of life and death. I just recently gave a lecture to my non-Western class on Buddhism, and Buddhism pretty much accepts that the reality of life is suffering and death. But the modern world, we live in this world where death can't touch us. Boy, has coronavirus just proven what an illusion that is. Has totally demonstrated what an illusion that is. And so I think this is a very powerful piece, that it confronts us with mortality in an art gallery. And it was shocking, and it really did confront us. He did a whole series of these. This is probably the most famous one he's ever done. This was the one that was sold for $12 million. This is the physical impossibility of death in the mind of someone living. And it's a shark. It's a shark suspended in a tank of formaldehyde. So this tiger shark suspended in a tank of formaldehyde was, again, a shark is not something, it's this symbol of terror. And of course, if any of you are familiar with, reality TV, the reality TV explosion that happened in the late 1990s, one of the big reality TV events was Shark Week. It's astonishing. Humans kill millions of sharks every year, and maybe one or two people gets killed by a shark. Really, getting killed by a shark is one of the rarest ways to get killed in the world. It's even rarer than getting hit by lightning or something like that. And yet, we hype it. There's something terrifying. We think about the movie Jaws. We think about this animal as this terrible predator, and it's terrifying. And it's terrifying in large part because it's under the water, because you can't see it. And it moves stealthily and then consumes you. And so for Damien Hirst, this became the perfect metaphor of death. And like a lot of his early works, this thing explores the concept of death. And so he wanted to bring death into the gallery so that it could be confronted. Hence the title, The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living. While we're living, we can't possibly come to terms with it. There's two versions of this. When he first started building these tank pieces, he was building them himself and hired a fisherman to go get himself a tiger shark. But he's not a welder. He's not a person who's trained in preserving animal flesh or taxidermy. So the first shark disintegrated. So he actually commissioned a hunter to get another shark and hired someone to build a tank and got it professionally preserved. This is the first version. So if you see a photo of this, you'll notice that shark looks different. Yeah, because it's a completely different shark. The original just disintegrated in the tank and turned into goo in the tank. Well, that won't do. You've got to have this terrifying shark image. So It's the reality of modern medias. He does a whole series of these. This one is called Some Comfort Gained in the Acceptance of the Inherent Lies in Everything. And it's a cow that's been sliced into pieces so that you can walk in between of it. He did mother and mother and child separated, where he took a cow and a calf and separated. And these are real cows. These are real cows. These are animals that he got and hired somebody to preserve. So I think these death pieces are very, very serious, very interesting pieces. Conceptually, they're beautiful, and I think in execution, they're quite powerful as well. And so by the late 1990s, Damien Hirst was one of these artists who was commanding millions for original works of art. And then things change. He fundamentally changes. He becomes a kind of new iteration of Andy Warhol's factory. He stops actually making these things himself and hires a large entourage to create them for him. And he does a series of places where he has medicine cabinets. He does spin paintings with skulls. Spin paintings, of course, is where you have a canvas on a turntable and you put the paint on it and then spin it up so this paint splatters in all direction. This is the very epitome of kitsch. He starts doing a whole series of dot paintings. I should say he doesn't start doing. He has somebody else do them. And so for most of the early 2000s, he explores a completely different kind of art, an art that's much less conceptual. It's not deconstructing humanity. It's deconstructing the artist. You have these butterfly paintings. These are made out of butterfly wings. This is an art form that he discovered in Mexico. So he hired a bunch of artists to do these things. And in most of these cases, he's not even designing these things. He's actually kind of managing a group of people to create these things. This is one of the most famous ones he's done, and this is the one I chose for the thumbnail for this class, for this section of the class, This is for the Love of God. And it's an actual human skull, and it's covered in platinum and diamonds. Just in diamonds, this thing was worth nearly $2 million. And of course, he had a craftsman to make this. His hands never touched this. So the very, irony of the piece, for the love of God, the commercialism of it, the features of it, the diamonds, the scale of it, the complications of it. It's glitzy, it's kitschy. And so there's a very different tone to Damien Hirst's work. And what's interesting is that it's almost as if once he achieved fame, his work became predominantly about deconstructing the fame of an artist. I had a student wrote a brilliant paper about him once, and I think the student was absolutely right. This was when I was teaching at BYU. A student wrote a paper trying to explain why was his earlier work so weighty and conceptual, but his later work was so light and frothy. And what he was doing is that, having become a famous artist, one of these sensation artists, one of these young British artists that could now command millions of dollars, he was going to deconstruct himself. That these later pop, kitschy kind of imagery, spin paintings, this is the kind of stuff you get at, carnivals and stuff. These dot paintings, which are just, simple things, and diamond encrusted skulls. He was deconstructing the famous artist himself. He was pushing it to these ridiculous absurds. I really wish I knew if that was true. I'd love to sit down and talk with him, of course. But again, as I've mentioned many times before, you can take it to the bank. Postmodernists lie. It's what they do. They believe that there's no essential truth and that everything is language. So if you tell a lie, it doesn't matter. It's another expression of truth. It's the fake, which I think is cool, which is a different kind of expression. His latest work has been in recreating a fake archaeological expedition. That is, that he's had all of these wonderful, you should go look it up. He's created all of these objects, sometimes massive statues, one statue even 40 feet tall. Except these statues have deliberate anachronisms, like, Mickey Mouse in them. and yet these have been excavated apparently from the bottom of the ocean as if they are treasures from a lost Atlantis. And this show got terribly criticized, but I'm not really certain why, because it's essentially the same thing he's been doing for the last 20 years, like these diamond-encrusted skulls. They are over the top, very clearly false narratives, deconstructions, anachronisms, reappropriations, all of those things. So I'm not really sure why this is so much different. I think people are kind of tired of it. He's been on this same vein. He's been mining this same vein of ore for 20 years now. I mean, his earlier works, very provocative, but he's been in this kind of system of reinterpreting his own fame and his own role as a contemporary artist. I don't find it terribly engaging. I find it kind of flat. I really like Damien Hirst's early stuff. His later stuff strikes me as the same way that Jeff Koons stuff does, except it has even less craftsmanship to it. It's not as Jeff Koons stuff is big and bright and fun, and this stuff isn't even as big and bright and as fun as that. So he's now kind of a low rent Jeff Koons to me, and you know my opinion of Jeff Koons. So that gets us up to the 20th century. Now, there's a couple of things that I still want to talk about more. Again, these lectures went long. I did have a couple more topics. We got behind even before the coronavirus thing, and we're still behind. But I do want to cover some important topics. So what I might do next week and the week after is I'm going to try and do shorter, kind of 20 to 30 minute kind of lectures on some other topics that we haven't quite covered well enough in the class that I think you need to know about. One is new media, digital art and new media. That's been a huge change in art. This innovation of digital art is really going to be a big deal. And interactive art, computer-controlled art. The other thing I want to bring up is I want to talk about outsider art, and as a function of outsider art, graffiti art, and urban art and street art. The big movement of the early 2000s, which is still continuing today, is the fact that most of the biggest artists now aren't really making things for galleries. They're making things outside of galleries. And it would just be a shame if we didn't get to talk about Banksy and JR and a bunch of others. So we'll talk about that. And then finally, we want to talk about global art. That one of the reasons we don't have a kind of coherent movement in the last 20 years is that it's a global world. As the coronavirus has really driven home, we are an interconnected world. And contemporary art had always been seen as an extension of Western ideas, but increasingly we're seeing non-Western influence come into it, and it is no longer a purely Western phenomenon. And so the expansion of a sense of a global identity, an expansive identity that includes all genders, all orientations, many different races, many different nationalities, that's another major direction of where art is going. And so we'll do a short little lecture on that. So I will expect those to drop sometime next Wednesday. For Monday, I will be posting a discussion group, and this discussion group will be for the first set of presentations. Take a look at pages. I'll try to get that discussion group up so you know where to post it. And what I want you to do is I want you to post a link to your presentation. You can do the presentation in Prezi and Google Presentation and PowerPoint, whatever. But if you upload it, make sure it includes the text. You do not have to do a voiceover, but if you would rather do this as a voiceover, we just need enough text so that we can follow your presentations. So you will post your presentations up. Let's just say they have to be up by midnight on that day that your presentation is assigned. These discussion groups will be organized by topic. So painting and sculpture will be grouped together. Installation will be grouped together. Performance will be grouped together, etc., etc. And you will have to post in your discussion group. And in addition to posting about your discussion group, your instead of not just you don't have to post your presentation, I also want you to comment on 2 other presentations. it might be a little bit troublesome for you to comment on all. If you want to comment on all, that would be great to give people feedback. But I want you to ask a question from at least a question or make a comment on at least 2 other of the presentations. And every student should make a comment on at least a comment on 2 of those presentations in each one of those groups. And your participation score is going to be dependent on that. So make sure you get at least 2. I don't think that's too much of a burden. And then you can look at those presentations at your leisure and take a look at them, and also keep an eye out for some of these upcoming topics we need to talk about. And so that's where we are. We're essentially going to be doing the presentation discussions and a few of these mini lectures, and that'll take us to the end of the semester. The one other thing you should do for your presentations, and I'll make an announcement of this on Canvas, is I want you to select a single work of art by your artist, or a single work of art from your topic if you're not doing a specific artist, that was in your presentation. And I want you to make sure that you write out the artist, title, date, period, medium, and location for that work of art as a suggestion for the final exam. I won't use all of them because I've got 22 students in the class. I would add another 22 things to the already growing review sheet. But we do want to include some of these artists that you're covering on the final exam. So some of these artists that are in your presentation definitely are certainly worthy of being covered on the final exam. So pick an image from your presentation that you think is best representative of the movement or the artist that you're talking about, and we'll put that on the presentation. If your artist is already on the review sheet, well, then I guess you're covered. So you don't need to worry about that. But if your artist isn't on the review sheet already, make sure you get that in. All right. Thank you very much, and I look forward to those presentations on Monday. See you then. Bye-bye.